1. The Red Bike and the Fire in the Belly, 1942 to 1960.
All right, picture Louisville, Kentucky in the 1940s. This isn't the flashy, glitzy America you see in movies today. This is the Jim Crow South. Segregation is the law of the land. If you're black, you can't eat at the same counters, you can't use the same bathrooms, and you're basically told every single day that you're a second-class citizen. In the middle of this, in 1942, a kid named Cassius Marcellus Clay Jr. is born. His dad, Cassius Sr., paints signs for a living, and his mom, Odessa, cleans houses. They're a hard-working middle-class family, but they live in a world that's designed to keep them small. But Cassius Jr., he wasn't born to be small. He was loud, he was fast, and he had a motor that never stopped running. But the funny thing is, he didn't start boxing because he wanted to be a hero. He started boxing because someone stole his bike. Imagine being 12 years old. It's 1954. You just got a brand new red and white Schwinn bicycle. For a kid in that neighborhood, that bike was a Ferrari. Cassius and his friend ride over to a local fair. They leave their bikes outside, and when they come back, poof, it's gone. Cassius is crying. He's furious. He's ready to kill whoever did it. Someone tells him there's a police officer in the basement of a nearby building. He runs down there, tears in his eyes, and tells the cop, Joe Martin, "I'm gonna whoop whoever stole my bike." Joe Martin looks at this skinny, lanky kid and says the words that change history. Well, you better learn how to fight before you start whooping people. Martin ran a boxing gym in that basement. Cassius started coming every day. He wasn't the strongest kid, and he definitely wasn't the toughest in the traditional sense, but he had something nobody else had: speed. He moved like a ghost. Most boxers stand there and take hits. Cassius danced. He kept his hands low. He leaned back, and he made guys look like they were swinging at air. By the time he was a teenager, he was dominating the amateur scene. He won 6 Kentucky Golden Gloves titles and 2 national titles. But it wasn't just his hands that were moving, it was his mouth. He started calling himself the greatest before he'd even won a real belt. He'd tell people exactly what round he was going to knock them out. People called him the Louisville Lip. Half the people loved him, and the other half wanted to see someone shut him up, which, as he realized early on, is a great way to sell tickets. In 1960, he gets the big call, the Rome Olympics. Now, here's the irony, Bud. He's going to represent the United States of America, a country where he still can't walk into a whites-only restaurant in his own hometown. He's 18 years old, terrified of flying. He actually bought a parachute and wore it on the plane the whole way to Italy. But once he got in the ring, he was untouchable. He danced his way to the gold medal. He came back to America as a hero, or at least he thought he was. The story goes, and it's a legendary one, that he went into a diner in Louisville, wearing his Olympic gold medal around his neck, and asked for a burger. The waitress looked at him and said, "We don't serve Negroes here." Cassius looked at her and said, "That's okay, I don't eat him. Just give me a burger." They still kicked him out. He was the best in the world. He had a gold medal for his country, and he still couldn't get a sandwich. Some stories say he was so disgusted that he walked down to the Ohio River and threw his gold medal into the water. Whether he actually threw it or just lost it, the sentiment was the same. The medal didn't change the world. He realized that if he wanted respect, he was going to have to take it. He turned pro right after that. He was undefeated. He was flashy, and he was heading straight for the heavyweight crown. But the world didn't realize that the Louisville Lip was about to become something much more dangerous than a boxer. He was about to find his voice, find a new faith, and change his name to something the world would never forget.
Part 2. Shaking Up the World and the Birth of Ollie, 1960 to 1964.
So, Cassius Clay turns pro in late 1960. He's got a group of wealthy white businessmen from Louisville backing him. The Louisville Sponsoring Group. They're putting up the money, and he's putting in the work. He moves to Miami to train at the Fifth Street Gym with a legendary trainer named Angelo Dundee. Dundee was a genius. He realized that you didn't coach a guy like Cassius Clay by trying to change him. You just sharpened what he already had. Cassius fought wrong. He kept his hands down by his waist. He leaned away from punches instead of blocking them, and he danced around the ring like a ballerina. Traditional boxing experts hated it. They said he's going to get his head knocked off the first time he fights a real power hitter. But while he was training, he was also marketing. Cassius started hanging out with a pro wrestler named Gorgeous George. George was this flamboyant guy who wore robes and told the crowd how beautiful he was. Cassius realized that people would pay a lot of money to see someone they hated get beat up. So he turned the volume up to 11. He started predicting the exact round his opponents would fall. He'd write poems about it. You think the world was shocked when Nixon resigned? Wait till I whoop Sonny Liston's behind. The big, ugly bear. By 1964, he's 19-0, but there's a wall in front of him, and that wall's name is Sonny Liston. Listen, man, Sonny Liston was the scariest human being on the planet. He was a former enforcer for the mob. He had hands the size of dinner plates, and he looked like he was carved out of granite. He had just destroyed the previous champ, Floyd Patterson, in the first round. Twice. Nobody, and I mean nobody, thought Cassius Clay had a chance. The odds were 7-1 against him. Some reporters were literally worried that Clay was going to get killed in the ring. But Cassius was playing mind games. He drove a bus to Liston's training camp with "World's Most Wanted" painted on the side. He stood outside Liston's house at 3 a.m., screaming, "I'm gonna whoop you, you big ugly bear." He acted so crazy that Liston's camp thought he was genuinely terrified and trying to hide it. February 25th, 1964. Miami Beach. The bell rings, and the world holds its breath. But instead of getting knocked out, Cassius is invisible. He's too fast. Liston is swinging these massive haymaker punches, and Clay is just slipping them by an inch, laughing at him. By the 6th round, Liston is exhausted. His eyes are swollen shut, and he's completely demoralized. He stays on his stool for the 7th round. He quits. Cassius Clay is the heavyweight champion of the world at 22 years old. He jumps around the ring, screaming at the reporters, "I shook up the world. I am the greatest. I'm a king. I'm pretty." The name change. But the real shocker came the next morning. For months, there had been rumors that Cassius was hanging out with the Nation of Islam, a black nationalist religious group led by Elijah Muhammad. The media hated them. They called them a hate group. The most famous face of the nation was a guy named Malcolm X. Malcolm and Cassius had become best friends. Malcolm was like a big brother and a spiritual mentor to him. The day after the fight, Cassius Clay announced to the world, "I believe in Allah and in peace. I'm not a Christian anymore." A few days later, Elijah Muhammad gave him a new name. He said Cassius Clay was a slave name. He gave him the name Muhammad Ali. The white media went ballistic. They refused to call him Ali. They kept calling him Clay. They thought it was a phase. But Ali stood his ground. He said the most famous line of his early career, "I don't have to be what you want me to be. I'm free to be who I want." Think about the balls that took, man. He just became the champ. He could have had every endorsement deal in the world, but he chose to join a group that half of America hated because it was his truth. He wasn't just a boxer anymore. He was a symbol of black power and religious freedom. But while he was reaching the top of the world, a storm was brewing. A war was starting in a place called Vietnam, and the U.S. government was about to send Muhammad Ali a letter that would change everything. The champ was about to face a fight that no amount of dancing could slip.
Part 3. The Phantom Punch and the Price of Principle, 1964 to 1967.
So, Ali is a champ. He's young, he's fast, and he's the most controversial man in America. But the boxing world wasn't ready to let go of Sonny Liston yet. They thought the first fight was a fluke, a lucky win because Liston had a bad shoulder. They wanted a rematch. May 25th, 1965. Lewiston, Maine. This wasn't a glitzy arena in Vegas. It was a small youth center in a tiny town. The vibe was weird, man. The Nation of Islam was being watched by the FBI. Malcolm X had just been assassinated a few months earlier, and people were literally afraid there'd be a shootout at ringside. The bell rings. Less than 2 minutes into the first round, Ali throws a right hand. It was so fast that half the crowd didn't even see it. Liston goes down like he's been shot. Ali doesn't go to a neutral corner. He stands over Liston, screaming, "Get up and fight, sucker!" That's the legendary photo. Bud, the Phantom Punch. People still argue today if Liston took a dive, or if Ali was just that fast. But the replay showed it. A short, chopping right hand that caught Liston right on the chin. Liston was done. Ali was the undisputed king. For the next 2 years, Ali was a machine. He defended his title 9 times. He went to London, Frankfurt, and Toronto. He fought Cleveland Williams in 1966 in what many called a perfect boxing performance. He was hitting guys from angles they didn't know existed. He was at the absolute peak of his physical powers. He was untouchable. But while he was conquering the ring, the U.S. government was ramping up the war in Vietnam. They needed soldiers. And they decided they needed the heavyweight champion of the world. In 1966, Ali got the news that his draft status had been changed to 1A, eligible for service. When a reporter asked him about it, he didn't give a PR-friendly answer. He said the line that shook the foundations of the country. "I ain't got no quarrel with them Viet Cong." Think about the context, man. It's 1966. Most of the country still supports the war. To say that as a black man, a man who couldn't even get a burger in his own hometown, was revolutionary. He was saying, Why should I go 10,000 miles away to kill brown people who never call me a racial slur, while my own people are being treated like dogs right here in America? April 28th, 1967. Houston, Texas. Ollie walks into the induction center. An officer calls his name, Cassius Clay. Ollie doesn't move. He calls it again. And again. Ollie stands there silent, stone-faced. He refused to step forward. The hammer came down instantly, and I mean instantly. Before he even left the building, the New York State Athletic Commission suspended his boxing license. Within hours, he was stripped of his heavyweight title. The prime of his life, ages 25 to 28, was taken away. He was convicted of draft evasion, sentenced to 5 years in prison, and fined $10,000. He didn't go to jail right away because he appealed, but he couldn't fight. He couldn't earn a living. He was the most hated man in America to some, and a hero to others. He went from being a world-class athlete to a traveling lecturer, speaking at colleges, broke, and exiled from the sport he loved. He lost his belt, he lost his money, and he lost his prime. But he didn't lose his soul. He was about to spend 3.5 years in the wilderness, waiting for the world to catch up to him. And when he finally came back, the world and the sport would never be the same.
Of the weight, equilibrium is a ghost state. Pressure from the ceiling starts to fracture the light. A silent resistance in the middle of the night. A silent resistance in the middle of the night. Shatter the glass, let the fever out. We're finding the strength in the middle of the doubt.
Part 4. The Wilderness and the Fight of the Century, 1967 to 1971.
Imagine being the fastest, strongest, most famous athlete on the planet, and suddenly you're a ghost. For 3.5 years, from age 25 to nearly 29, Muhammad Ali didn't put on a pair of boxing gloves for a professional fight. Those are the years when a heavyweight is usually at his absolute physical peak. He should have been racking up millions and defending his belt. Instead, he was traveling across America in a bus, speaking at college campuses for a few $100s a pop. At first, the crowds at these colleges were hostile. They saw him as a draft dodger. But as the 1960s rolled on and more body bags came back from Vietnam, the mood in America shifted. Students started realizing Ollie was right. He wasn't just a loudmouth anymore. He was a prophet. He was broke. His cars were repossessed, and his marriage was under strain. But his spirit was untouched. He'd tell the students, "I'm not losing anything by not fighting. I'm gaining my pride." By 1970, the legal walls started to crumble. A state senator in Georgia realized that Georgia didn't have a state boxing commission, which meant they could grant Ollie a license. On October 26, 1970, Ollie finally stepped back into the ring in Atlanta against Jerry Quarry. He was older, he was a bit heavier, and he'd lost that lightning-fast bounce in his step. But the speed in his hands? still there. He cut Quarry open in 3 rounds. The king was back, but there was a new king on the throne, Smokin' Joe Frazier. Joe Frazier was everything Ollie wasn't. He was quiet, he was humble, and he fought like a human wrecking ball. He didn't dance. He just moved forward, bobbing and weaving, throwing a left hook that could put a hole through a brick wall. While Ollie was in exile, Frazier had won the title, and Ollie, being Ollie, started the psychological warfare immediately. He called Frazier too ugly to be champ, and in a move that he'd later regret, he called Joe an Uncle Tom. He portrayed Joe as the white man's champ and himself as the people's champ. It made the rivalry personal and bitter. Joe had actually lent Ollie money during his exile, so he felt totally betrayed. March 8th, 1971. The fight of the century. Madison Square Garden, New York City. This wasn't just a boxing match. It was a cultural civil war. You had Frank Sinatra at ringside taking photos for Life magazine. You had every movie star, politician, and mobster in the building. The world was split down the middle. You were either for Ollie or for Frazier. The fight was 15 rounds of pure, unadulterated violence. Ollie started fast, mocking Joe, shaking his head every time Joe hit him. But Frazier wouldn't stop. He kept coming, digging hooks into Ollie's ribs, catching with that terrifying left. By the late rounds, Ollie was exhausted. His face was swollen like a balloon. In the 15th round, Joe timed it perfectly. He launched a left hook that caught Ollie flush on the jaw. Ollie went down. The world gasped. Ollie actually got up, which was a miracle in itself. But the damage was done. Joe Frazier won a unanimous decision. For the first time in his professional life, Muhammad Ali had lost. The invincible hero was human after all. People thought he was finished. They said the layoff had robbed him of his magic. But they didn't understand Ali. He didn't see it as the end. He saw it as the beginning of a long, painful climb back to the top. He had to go through the fire to get his belt back, and that path was going to lead him through a rematch with Joe and eventually to a jungle in Africa that no one expected.
The tether snaps in the hollow light, just an echo in the dead of night. Yeah. Found your coffee ring on the wooden floor, like you're still waiting by the door. Mundane ghost in a mundane room, I'm sweeping up the dust of the bloom. Oh, the residue is all that.
Part 5. The Broken Jaw and the African Miracle, 1971 to 1974.
After losing to Joe Frazier, the world thought Muhammad Ali was a relic of the past. He was pushing 30, his legs weren't as fast, and there was a new generation of monsters coming up. But Ali didn't go away. He fought everyone. He took on 10 fights in 2 years just to stay sharp and pay the bills. But in 1973, he hit another massive wall. He fought a guy named Ken Norton. Ken Norton was a former Marine with a body like a Greek god and a style that was awkward for Ali. In the first round, Norton threw a punch that literally cracked Ali's jaw. Most humans would have collapsed or quit right then. Ali fought for 11 more rounds with a broken jaw, swallowing his own blood. He lost the decision. People said, "That's it. The greatest is finally broken. But Ali got his jaw wired shut, spent months in silence, and came back to beat Norton in a rematch just 6 months later. He was a man possessed. He then went on to beat Joe Frazier in a non-title rematch in 1974. He had cleared the field. There was only one man left, the new champion, George Foreman. If you think Sonny Liston was scary, George Foreman was a nightmare. He was younger, he was stronger, and he was destroying everyone in his path. He had knocked out Joe Frazier and Ken Norton in just 2 rounds each. He didn't just win, he demolished people. When the Rumble in the Jungle was announced in Zaire, now the Congo, the betting odds were heavily against Ali. People were genuinely terrified that Ali was going to be seriously hurt or even killed in the ring. But Ali arrived in Africa and did something Foreman couldn't do. He connected with the people. He walked the streets of Kinshasa. He talked to the locals, and he got them chanting, "Ali Bomé, Ali kill him." He turned the whole continent into his home turf, while Foreman stayed in his hotel room, brooding and hitting heavy bags. Ali was out in the sun, soaking up the energy of millions. October 30th, 1924. Kinshasa, Zaire. The fight starts at 4 a.m. local time to catch the American TV audience. Everyone expected Ali to dance, to use his old speed to stay away from Foreman's hammers. But Ali did something that shocked his trainer, Angelo Dundee, and the entire world. He went to the ropes. He leaned back as far as he could, covered his face with his gloves, and let George Foreman wail on him. This was the birth of the rope-a-dope. For 7 rounds, Foreman to the hardest punches in boxing history. He was hitting Ali in the ribs, the arms, and the head. Ali was whispering in George's ear, "Is that all you got, George? They told me you could hit." It was a psychological masterpiece. By the 8th round, Foreman was gassing out. His arms were heavy like lead. He had punched himself into exhaustion. In the final minute of the 8th round, Ali saw his opening. He stepped off the ropes, threw a lightning-fast combination, and ended it with a perfect right hand. Foreman spun around and crashed to the canvas. The world exploded. Muhammad Ali, at 32 years old, had done the impossible. He was the heavyweight champion of the world for the 2nd time. He had beaten the unbeatable monster with his brain as much as his fists. He had regained the crown that had been taken from him 7 years earlier. He wasn't just a boxer anymore. He was a global icon of resistance and intelligence. But being the champ meant everyone was coming for his head. And the most brutal fight of his entire life was still waiting for him in the heat of the Philippines.
Cold floors where the shadows grew tall. Had to grind through the winter to get to the fall. Vision clear through the static, I'm dodging the wall. Calculated to climb, now I'm ignoring the call. Stacking moments like bricks, I'm building a zone. Vision clear through the static, I'm dodging the wall. Calculated to climb, I'm dodging the wall. Calculated to climb, now I'm ignoring the call. Stacking moments like bricks, I'm building a zone. No handouts in the dark, now I'm holding the zone. No handouts in the dark, I was handling my own. Level up, move in silence, my focus is grown. Every seed that I planted is finally shown. I was bet on the losing, now I'm holding the deck. Checking the vision, they can't put a check on the neck. Now we're standing on.
Part 6. The Manila Inferno and the War on Ignorance, 1975 to 1977.
So, Ali is back on the throne after the miracle in Zaire. He has the belt. He has the world in his pocket. But there's still one name that haunts him like a ghost in the night. Joe Frazier. Their score was 1-1. One win for Joe in the fight of the century, and one win for Ali in their second meeting. To the world, the debate was still open. To Ali, his legacy depended on proving that he was a better man once and for all. This led them to the Philippines in October 1975 for a fight that will be known as the Thrilla in Manila. Ali, being the master of psychological warfare, took his insults to a dark place. He started calling Frazier a gorilla and mocking him relentlessly. He thought it was just selling the fight. But for Joe Frazier, a man who grew up in the hard dirt of South Carolina, it was a deep, personal insult to his humanity. While Ali was joking for the cameras, Frazier was in his gym, hitting the bag until his knuckles bled, visualizing Ali's face. The heat in Manila was unlike anything either man had ever felt. It was over 100 degrees outside, and inside the Coliseum, under bright television lights, it felt like 120. There was no air conditioning. The air was thick, wet, and stagnant. From the very first bell, it wasn't a boxing match. It was a war of attrition. Ali started fast, trying to knock Joe out early, but Frazier was like a wall that kept moving forward. By the middle rounds, they were both exhausted, leaning on each other, trading punches that would have killed a normal man. Ali later said that this was the closest he ever felt to death. He could feel his organs screaming, his brain rattling in his skull, but he refused to go down. In the 14th round, Ali found a second wind and nearly blinded Frazier with a barrage of right hands. Joe's eyes were swollen shut. He couldn't see the punches coming anymore. Between the 14th and 15th rounds, Frazier's trainer, Eddie Futch, looked at his fighter and said, "Sit down, son. It's over. No one will ever forget what you did here today." At the exact same moment in the other corner, Ali was telling his own trainer to cut his gloves off. He was ready to quit too. But because Frazier's corner moved first, Ali was the winner. He stood up to celebrate, then immediately collapsed from pure exhaustion. He had won the battle, but he had left a piece of his soul in that ring. He admitted afterward that Joe Frazier was the greatest fighter in the world next to himself. But while Ali was conquering the ring, he was also fighting a much bigger, quieter war, the war against ignorance. People often looked at Ali as just a loudmouth athlete or a dumb boxer, but Ali was deeply aware of the intellectual chains that held his people back. He realized that the biggest enemy of progress was a lack of education and the mental slavery that told black people they weren't capable of being thinkers, poets, or leaders. He started using his global fame to travel places like Egypt, India, and across Africa, not just to show off his belt, but to learn. He became a self-taught scholar of human rights. He realized that the ignorance of the West regarding the East, and vice versa, was what caused wars. He began to speak at universities about the black scholar and the importance of self-respect. He would tell young kids that they didn't have to be boxers or singers to be greatest. They could be doctors, lawyers, or teachers. He fought the ignorance of the era by proving that a man from a segregated background in Kentucky could outwit the smartest reporters in London or New York. He used his poetry and his wit as a weapon against the stereotype that black men were only good for their muscles. He would often sit for hours after his training sessions, talking to students about philosophy and religion. He wanted to bridge the gap between different cultures. He realized that racial prejudice was just a form of ignorance, a blindness of the heart. He used his platform to educate the white public about the reality of the black experience. And he used his fame to show the black community that the world was much bigger than their local neighborhoods. He was trying to cure the illiteracy of the spirit. However, the physical price of his wars was starting to show. His speech was beginning to slow down just a little bit. His hands had a tiny tremor that he tried to hide. His doctors told him to walk away while he was still the king. But Ali was addicted to the love of the crowd and the mission he felt he had to fulfill. He felt he was the only man who could speak for the invisible people of the world. He kept fighting, not for the money, but because he thought he was invincible. He didn't realize that the ignorance he was fighting now was his own refusal to accept that he was human, and that his time in the ring was coming to a close.
Part 7. The Third Crown and the Creeping Shadow, 1978 to 1981.
By 1978, the butterfly was no longer floating. Muhammad Ali was 36 years old, which is ancient for a heavyweight who relies on speed. His body was a map of every punch he'd ever taken from Frazier, Foreman, and Norton. He was supposed to have an easy night against a young kid named Leon Spinks. Spinks only had 7 professional fights. He was a novice, but Ali didn't train properly. He was ignorant of his own limitations, thinking his name alone could win fights. Spinks outworked him and took the title in a massive upset. For the first time, Ali looked truly old in the ring, but the greatest couldn't go out like that. He demanded a rematch, worked his tail off, and in September 1978, he beat Spinks in front of 60,000 people in New Orleans. He became the first man in history to win the heavyweight championship 3 separate times. He should have stopped right there. He retired, but the silence of retirement was louder than the roar of the crowd. He missed the stage. He missed being the center of the universe. Against the advice of every doctor, he came back in 1980 to fight his former sparring partner, Larry Holmes. It was one of the hardest things to watch in sports history. Ali was a shell of himself. He was on medication that made him sluggish, and his reflexes were gone. Holmes, who loved Ali, was literally crying while he hit him. It wasn't a fight. It was a tragedy. Ali's corner stopped it in the 10th round. It was the only time he was ever stopped in his career. He fought one more time against Trevor Berbick in 1981, losing a sad decision, and finally, the gloves were hung up for good. But even as his body began to fail him and the tremors of Parkinson's disease started to set in, Ali's war against ignorance shifted into a new gear. He realized that his voice, even if it was becoming a whisper, had more power than his fists ever did. He started focusing on his role as a global ambassador. He went to Lebanon to try and negotiate the release of hostages. He later went to Iraq to talk to Saddam Hussein. He was fighting the ignorance of world leaders who saw people as pawns. He was using his fame to prove that a man's value isn't in his physical strength, but in his character and his willingness to sacrifice for peace. He began to speak about the ignorance of racism with even more clarity during this time. He would say that a person who hates another because of their skin color is like a person who hates a flower because of its color. It is illogical and small-minded. He spent his final years in the ring and his first years in retirement showing the world that even when your body betrays you, your mind can stay free. He was preparing for his final and most important role, the man who would carry the torch for all of humanity.
iron waits in the throat of the sun, a story told before the day is done. We walk the shadows where the silence grows, through the lexicon that no one knows. A common hand on a stone-cold wall, we hear the memory before the fall. One breath remains where the bridge is burned. The page is open, but the lesson's unlearned. Oh, let the truth be a chisel of light, breaking the stone in the heart of the night. Every path is a debt we must pay, toward the horizon that won't fade away. From the iron hand to the breath in the bone, we stand in the light of the truth we have known. We stand in the light of the truth we have known.
Part 8. The Silent Prophet and the Flame of Atlanta, 1984 to 1996.
By 1984, the world finally had a name for the tremor in Muhammad Ali's hands and the slowness in his speech. Parkinson's syndrome. Most people look at the diagnosis as a tragedy, a cruel joke played by fate on a man who was once the fastest and loudest human on the planet. The experts in the media immediately started pointing fingers at the boxing ring, saying the thousands of punches he took in those final unnecessary fights had finally caught up to him. But Ali, in his typical fashion, looked at it differently. He didn't see himself as a victim of boxing or a victim of fate. He famously said that God gave him the illness to remind him and the world that he was not the greatest in a divine sense, but just a man. He said it was a test of his faith, a way to show people how to handle adversity with dignity. The transition from the man who could talk 100 miles an hour to a man who struggled to get out a single sentence was a shock to the global system. But funny thing happened. The less Ali spoke, the more the world listened. His silence became a form of power. Before, people listened to him because he was entertaining and provocative. Now, they listened because they had to lean in close to hear his whisper. He began to fight the ignorance associated with disability and chronic illness. In the 1980s, people often treated those with Parkinson's or similar conditions as if they were mentally diminished or gone. Ali proved them wrong every day. He traveled the world, shaking hands with presidents and paupers alike, his eyes still sparkling with the same wit, showing that the fire inside was still burning even if the chimney was a bit clogged. One of his most incredible acts of courage during this period had nothing to do with a boxing ring. In 1990, just before the Gulf War started, Saddam Hussein took dozens of foreigners hostage in Iraq, calling them human guests. The United States government was at a standoff. Muhammad Ali, despite his health and against the wishes of the State Department, flew to Baghdad. He sat across from Saddam Hussein, a man the world feared, and used his status as the most famous Muslim in the world to negotiate. He ran out of his Parkinson's medication during the trip and could barely move or speak. But he refused to leave until he had a deal. He flew back to America with 15 hostages. He had used his silence to save lives, proving that his impact was now purely spiritual and humanitarian. The absolute peak of this second act happened in 1996 at the Atlanta Olympics. For weeks, the world had been wondering who would light the Olympic cauldron. When the moment came and the secret was finally revealed, it was Muhammad Ali. He stood there on that high platform, his body trembling visibly from the Parkinson's, his arms shaking as he held the torch. The stadium went silent, and then a roar went up that was louder than any of his fights. Millions of people watching on TV were moved to tears. He wasn't the invincible warrior anymore. He was a human being showing the ultimate strength of the spirit. He lit that flame, and in that moment, he united the world again. He had conquered the ignorance that says a sick man is a weak man. He was the most loved person on earth, and he hadn't thrown a punch in 15 years. The power of presence. Ali showed that you don't need to shout to be heard. His physical presence became a symbol of resilience, the global diplomat. He visited refugee camps, hospitals, and soup kitchens from North Korea to South Africa, fighting the ignorance of poverty and neglect. The 1996 torch. This moment reintroduced Ali to a whole new generation who had never seen him fight, but saw him as a hero of the human spirit. Fighting the stigma by being so public with his illness, he became the face of Parkinson's research, helping to raise millions of dollars and educate the public on the disease. He had moved beyond sports, beyond religion, and beyond race. He was a universal symbol. But as he moved into his final years, the silence would become even deeper, and the world were to figure out how to carry on his legacy of fighting ignorance and hatred without him there to lead the way. He was becoming a living monument, a man who would survive the fire of the 20th century to become the conscience of the 21st.
Part 9. The Messenger of Peace and the Battle for Understanding, 1998 to 2011.
As the 20th century turned into the 21st, Muhammad Ali was no longer an athlete. He was a living monument. In 1998, the United Nations officially named him a Messenger of Peace. This wasn't just an honorary title to put on a plaque. For Ali, it was a license to go where others were afraid to tread. He focused his remaining energy on fighting the ignorance that fuels conflict between nations and religions. He realized that the world's biggest problem wasn't a lack of resources, but a lack of empathy and understanding. One of his most powerful moments during this era happened in 2002, just a year after the September 11 attacks. The world was filled with tension and suspicion toward the Islamic world. Ali, despite the heavy toll Parkinson's was taking on his body, traveled to Kabul, Afghanistan. He didn't go there for a political photo op. He went as a brother in faith. He visited a school for girls and a bakery run by widows, sitting in silence with people who had lost everything to decades of war. By simply being there, he was fighting the ignorance that painted an entire region as a land of enemies. He was showing that humanity has no borders. Back home in the United States, he faced another front in the war on ignorance. After September 11th, there was a massive wave of prejudice against Muslims. Ali, the most famous Muslim in the Western world, stepped up to the microphone. Even with his whispered speech, his words were like thunder. He stood in front of the cameras and said, "Islam is a religion of peace. It does not promote terrorism or killing people." He was educating a frightened public, telling them not to let the actions of a few define the hearts of billions. He was a bridge between the East and the West at a time when that bridge was being burned down. In 2005, Ali finally built a permanent home for his mission, the Muhammad Ali Center in Louisville, Kentucky. He didn't want it to be a museum filled with old boxing robes and trophies. He wanted it to be a place that fought ignorance by teaching. He built it around 6 core principles: confidence, belief in oneself, conviction, standing up for what you believe in no matter the cost, dedication, the hard work required to achieve greatness, giving, serving others, respect, treating everyone with dignity, spirituality, connecting with something greater than yourself. That same year, President George W. Bush awarded him the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian honor in the U.S. It was a surreal moment. The man who was once called a traitor for refusing the draft was now being honored in the White House for his service to humanity. It was the ultimate victory over the ignorance of his critics. He had outlasted the hatred, the prejudice, and the wars. He had become the greatest by proving that the heart is the strongest muscle in the human body. Ali was now moving into his final years, his silence becoming almost absolute. But even in that silence, he was teaching. He was showing the world how to grow old with grace, how to suffer with dignity, and how to leave a legacy that isn't about what you took from the world, but what you gave back. He was preparing for the final bell, knowing that his work was already etched into the soul of history.
Part 10. The Last Round and the Immortal Legacy, 2012 to 2016.
The final years of Muhammad Ali were a masterclass in quiet resilience. By the time 2011 rolled around, the man who once moved like lightning was mostly confined to his home in Scottsdale, Arizona, or his quiet farm in Michigan. His world had shrunk from the massive, screaming arenas of the 1970s to the peaceful garden of his own backyard. But if you think he was a broken man, you didn't understand Ali. He still had that playful glint in his eyes. He would perform magic tricks for visitors, making a silk scarf disappear even when his hands were shaking from the Parkinson's. He was showing the world that even when your physical shell is crumbling, the spark inside is untouchable. He was fighting the ultimate ignorance, the idea that a person's worth is tied to their physical utility. He was valuable just by being there, just by breathing, a living reminder of what it means to stand your ground until the very end. In early June 2016, the world got the news it had been dreading for decades. Ali was hospitalized in Phoenix with respiratory issues. For 2 days, the planet held its breath. On June 3rd, 2016, at the age of 74, the greatest of all time took his final bow. The official cause of death was septic shock, but in a way, he had outlived every medical expectation. His heart, that massive engine of spirit, reportedly kept beating for 30 minutes after his other organs had failed. His daughter Hannah said it was as if he was refusing to leave the ring without one last fight. He didn't just pass away. He finished his mission. The mourning that followed was unlike anything the world had ever seen for an athlete. It wasn't just a sports hero dying. It was a global conscience. From the ghettos of the south side of Chicago to the remote villages of Africa and the palaces of Europe, people felt like they had lost a member of their own family. His funeral in Louisville was a week-long celebration that he had spent years planning himself. He called the plan the book. He wanted his death to be his final and most important lesson in peace. He insisted that his funeral be open to everyone, regardless of their religion or race. He had a traditional Muslim janazah service, but he also had a public memorial where a Jewish comedian, a former American president, and a Native American leader all spoke. He brought the world together one last time, proving that his vision of a united humanity wasn't just a dream, it was possible. As the funeral procession moved through the streets of Louisville, 100,000 people lined the sidewalks. They threw flowers at the hearse and chanted, "Ali, Ali," just like they did in Zaire and Manila 40 years earlier. He was buried in Cave Hill Cemetery under a simple headstone that just says, Ali. He didn't need a list of titles or a long list of medals. The name was enough. He left behind a world that was fundamentally different because he had been in it. He proved that a man could be a warrior for peace, a poet of the people, and a champion of truth all at once. He showed us that the greatest fight isn't the one you have with your fists, but the one you have with your own fears and the ignorance of the world around you. He didn't just shake up the world. He made it a more courageous place for all of us to live in.
The iron gate is heavy with the morning dew. One side waits for the sun, the other does too. A kite string caught in the barbed wire line. Two children pulling, making everything fine. They don't see the markers, they just see the sky. Small hands and the wind, learning how to fly. Oh, it's a quiet hum in the heart of the storm. A quiet hum, a fragile light that keeps the spirit warm. Peace is a bridge made of breath and of bone. Walking the distance, no one walks alone. No one walks alone. A thermos shared on a cold city bench. Steam rises up, erasing the wrench of 1,000 different tongues and 1,000 different fears. Just a moment of silence and coffee for years. A nod across the divide, a look in the eye. Heavy walls of the city can't reach the sky. The maps are just ink on a page. The lines are just bars on a cage. But the heart is a river that knows where to go. It follows the warmth and the natural flow. Let it flow. Let it flow. Oh, it's a quiet hum in the heart of the storm. A fragile light that keeps the spirit warm. Peace is a bridge made of breath and of bone. Walking the distance, no one walks alone. No one walks alone. No one walks alone. No one walks alone. Just a quiet hum.